Hello and welcome to another edition of the Pitt Mailbag Show from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We're your hosts, Chris Carter and Stephen Thompson, your Pitt beat reporters here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As always, you can find the show every Tuesday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Tuesday episodes, as well as our post-game recaps after Pitt basketball games in the ACC, as well as Pitt football games. We'll be doing a lot here on this show. Let's get into a few things here, Stephen. The transfer portal season is underway, and we got a few questions about it. We're going to lead with a question that we got from Robbie, who says, what are the Pitt football transfer portal losses so far, and are any of them a big deal yet?
Yeah, so Pitt's maybe lost about, I want to say around a dozen. I can't say I've counted exactly, but they've lost, pretty close to double-digit number of players. You've seen a lot more over the past few days, kind of this weekend. Not many of them are huge names. I think the one that everyone will recognize is Nate Yarnell, the backup quarterback, who was kind of never able to earn a job as a full-time starter. But that one was pretty expected, right? So not many of these are huge losses. I mean, you could say Nahki Johnson is a loss as well. He was a depth piece on the defensive line. Same could be said for Terrence Moore, who was the starting center for the last 9 games of the 2023 season, but ended up losing his job. That one, I would say, is actually more of a loss than people realize. I think depth on the offensive line is really important, as we've seen for the past really 3 years for Pitt football. But the one that I think I would be most concerned about is losing Daejon Reynolds, the wide receiver. Started a few games, I think, here and there in 2023, but was a reserve for the most part this year. But every time he had the ball thrown his way, I thought he was reliable. He had good hands, made that big play in the West Virginia game on 2nd and 30, catching a touchdown that sparked the big comeback in the fourth quarter. Wasn't targeted very often, didn't end up becoming a huge part of the offense, so I understand why he ended up transferring, but he, I think, was a better player than what his numbers would say. And I think Pitt, as they get set to lose Konate Mumfield, is going to be looking for guys to step up at receiver. And Daejon Reynolds was one of those guys that I was going to look for, but now he's going to look for another opportunity at a different school. And I think he's going to have a chance to play somewhere and be really productive wherever he goes.
I think that Daejon Reynolds certainly is a loss, especially with Konate Mumfield being gone. You're losing guys to the transfer portal. And Daejon Reynolds, I mean, heck, his catch on, what was that, 2nd and 40 or whatever against the Mountaineers.
2nd and 30, yeah.
That's one of the biggest catches of the year, maybe of the past several years. You have to go back to Jordan Addison to find a bigger catch in a Pitt game than that one bringing in. So yeah, losing him, stinks. I think for Pitt football. And Terrence Moore, you kind of need all the veteran experience you can on this offensive line next year. But one thing I always remind people is that when you see guys go, it doesn't automatically mean they're definitely gone. Guys like Brandon George came back last year or big assets. It also could be the sign like the coaches might be like, hey, we're going and getting people at this position. So, you have a decision to make. If you want, we're happy to have you here, but we're going and making some moves. And sometimes that leads to guys, leaving out early. Sometimes that leads to guys, sticking around. Sometimes it leads to guys coming back. So it's just go away and you know what? I don't want to deal with this anymore. But that's the world of college football and college sports in general. Teams and programs are always looking for the next guy that can be the guy at each position.
Yeah, and just like every player has the opportunity to move after every season, coaches, I think, have a little bit more leeway to make decisions themselves about whether or not a guy is a part of their future, like you alluded to. So not every loss means that, Pitt got outbid for a guy or something like that. I know that's always the fear, but sometimes these losses aren't necessarily that damning. And you're going to see teams all over the country lose a ton of guys every year. That just kind of happens. And you don't need to be overly concerned about everyone that you see or even the volume of guys that you see.
Absolutely. Let's get to another question here about recruiting and filling things in. C Michael 135 on X comes at us and says, if Pat Narduzzi is complaining about his offensive line, does he only have himself to blame since he recruits the unit? This is a good question, Stephen, because I do feel like, Pat Narduzzi, he came out, after Branson Taylor went down, he talked about the lack of depth and things like that. And it's like, look, that, it's not like he inherited this roster, right? This is his team. This is his program. Now, I do think there's always the natural turnover of things where you'll have a really strong group at a certain position for a while. And if you just have some misses in your recruiting, you're going to have a hole there. And I think that's the problem here is that Pitt's missed in its recruiting on its offensive line for a couple years, and they had a good line for a while. Guys like Marcus Minor, guys like Carter Warren, guys like Matt Gonsalves, Jimmy Morrissey, you can go back as far as him, Jake Cradle. They had answers on this offensive line for years, and now they're a little devoid of them because a lot of those guys went on. They didn't develop guys behind them too well, and guys like Ryan Baer were struggling. I think, Shirley has part of it to blame, but I think it's also just part of the natural things that happen in college sports eventually.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, Pat Narduzzi, I think complaining, maybe not the word that I would use, but pointing out that they are not very deep at offensive line. And, I think you could say this about every problem that Pitt football has. If you point out a problem with Pitt football, obviously everything ultimately goes up to the head coach, who is the one who hires everyone and recruits every player and has to approve everything that's done within that program. So, yeah, Pat Narduzzi does have no one to blame but himself. But I think also what you pointed out is that there is turnover. And I think something that people got uncomfortable with this year was the idea of a rebuild, especially after they started 7-0. The idea that this roster still had some holes and was maybe still recovering from that 3-9 season, which I think in large part was due to turnover from the 2021 and 2022 teams. So when you start an offensive line that I think in 2022 and into 2023 was mostly seniors and upperclassmen, that's a lot to turn over in a year. That's a lot to kind of replace in just 1 or 2 years. And if you're Pitt, you need to not only kind of rebuild the top line, but rebuild the depth as well. And that's a tricky thing to do. It's not kind of done overnight. I think Pitt has some talent on the offensive line, but that talent might not just be ready yet. So it's not necessarily about, is he continuing to rebuild his offensive line year to year? And he's failing at doing that. I think, you can look at this a little bit bigger picture and maybe look with a longer eye to what they're maybe building in the future. Now, I mean, if it happens again, that doesn't excuse him from not, recruiting that depth in the age of the transfer portal and everything like that as well. But I think if, I would just leave the door open to things maybe recovering next year and maybe them pulling some guys from the transfer portal or developing some guys with an off season of work and maybe being a little bit more solid going into next year.
Agreed. I think it's just sometimes you have bad groups or groups that just don't work out. And sometimes you've got groups that are just too young to work out. That Pitt offensive line before Jimmy Morrissey kind of took ownership of it wasn't a good one. They had a really good one. I think it was 2018 when they went to the ACC championship. 2019, a lot of those guys had left. It took some time for them to rebuild. But then I'd say by 2021, they had a really good offensive line again, and that played a big role in their ACC championship win that year. So goes the cycle sometimes of recruiting when you don't have unlimited NIL money to just keep refueling with 5 stars every 5 seconds. Let's go to a question here. We got a bowl question here, Steve, and this one comes from Griffin. What can Pitt get out of playing in the GameAbove Sports Bowl? If they lose to Toledo, it looks terrible. If they win, does it make their season really look any better? Steven, this is one of those classic questions that you come around every bowl season when you don't have a good year and you're just like, you just made it into bowl eligibility and you're taking whatever you can kind of get. You're not going to the Sun Bowl. You're not going to a New Year's Day bowl. You're just going to one of those bowls that people forget what it's even called or who even sponsored it after the day after it's played. I do think Pitt, if a win here can help, just end the season a little bit better. But I do kind of understand where Griffin's coming from. And another thing, part of this is the money. They get money for being in these bowl games. I think that's the bottom line, and Pitt needs money. But I also get that, if they lose this, it just makes this year look even worse when you lose to a team in the MAC.
It does. But, I don't think you turn down an extra opportunity to play, an extra
Agreed.
Opportunity to maybe end the season on a high note. I think you also think about just emotionally, these players have gone through a season, like a month and a half where they've done nothing but lose. I think they deserve a chance to go back out onto the field and try to end the season with a win. But the other thing, I think the more important thing is the, nearly month or 3 weeks of extra practices that they're going to get with guys who you have to assume are going to, for the most part, be there next year. I think bowl practices are pretty valuable, the chance to kind of see what you've got from young guys. Like you'd have to assume a Zion Fowler-El at receiver is going to play a ton. Joel Goff is going to play a ton at running back. You're going to see what you have at quarterback, maybe, depending on, whether David Lynch or Ty Dieffenbach. We're going to talk about that, I think, a little bit later. You're going to see other guys at along the defensive line, probably in the secondary and at linebacker too. You're going to get an opportunity to see a bunch of these new guys that will probably be playing either next year or the year after that. So these practices are still valuable. Every chance you get to go on the field and have a full practice with coaches there is valuable. I think that's what Pat Narduzzi would tell you as well. So it is valuable. I'd say the practices maybe more than the actual game itself, but game experience is really valuable as well. And to be honest, I mean, I think that's a perspective from a fan. And while you may not particularly enjoy watching Pitt play in the GameAbove Sports Bowl the day after Thanksgiving and what will likely be more than a half-empty Ford Field, if I had to guess, I mean, this team, I think, can get a lot more out of it than maybe the fans will, which, not instant gratification, but it's going to, I think, pay off down the road.
Look, sometimes you can take what you need to take, whatever vibes you can get. I remember the 2020 season looked lost, and they were able to finish that one strong. I think they won 6 or 7 games in that year, and that was the year when they kind of ended strong. They had a better idea of who they were. So if you can glean some things from this game, if you can get see what some younger guys that you haven't been able to play can show, that certainly is worth a lot. And again, like you said, you don't turn down invitations to play. You go play. That's what your program is for there. Let's go to a question here that's going to be about the depth there for Pitt football. Roy asks, I was interested that David Lynch, a walk-on and not Ty Dieffenbach, got snaps behind Nate Yarnell late in the season. Is there a story there? Is Dieffenbach the next portal candidate? Steven, I don't know if Ty Dieffenbach is the next portal candidate, but I do think it's just a sign that Pitt had 2 quarterbacks, and that was it this year. And there's not really someone really lined up behind them to take things over.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think as soon as you get into practices, whether you're a walk-on or a 3-star or a 2-star or a 4-star, kind of gets stripped away from you, right? Then it's just playing football. So the story, is there a story there? I think the story is that David Lynch was just better in practice and operated the offense better and showed a little bit more than Ty Dieffenbach did. That happens sometimes. I mean, it's not like Ty Dieffenbach was necessarily this blue-chip prospect that, turned out to be a bust or something like that. I think this happens sometimes. So I don't know if there's much of a story there. I don't know if Dieffenbach is going to enter the transfer portal. I mean, I'm not going to close the book on him at all. We really haven't seen anything from Dieffenbach at all in live game action. So I'm certainly not counting out that he could play in this bowl game or maybe be a piece for Pitt down the road. But at least for right now, it seems like Lynch is just maybe the guy that they trust a little bit more to operate the offense. And with Nate Yarnell not with the team anymore, if Eli Holstein can't go, you'd have to assume that David Lynch is your guy, especially just because he played at the end of the season for Pitt when Nate Yarnell went down.
Certainly looks that way. Quarterback battles can always get weird behind the scenes. You never know what's going on if you're a fan. And I think it's just a reminder that, hey, as reporters, we get one day to look at practice and we see about 20 minutes of it. So we don't even get to see all that. So who knows what could happen in this bowl game? Maybe it's David Lynch, maybe it's Ty Dieffenbach, maybe it's anyone else. That's where there could be a lot of different things that happen here. We'll see what happens when they play on December 26th in the bowl game. But we do got a Pitt basketball question because they are the team that's a little bit hotter right now. Pitt basketball 8-2. They fell to be unranked in the AP poll after becoming ranked 18th last week. They went 1-1 in the game since then, got destroyed by Mississippi State on the road, and then was able to gut out a road win over Virginia Tech. And now they are dropped out of the rankings. Several teams also jumped ahead of them as far as the teams that are just outside the top 25. Steven, you're one of the AP voters. Why do you hate Pitt so much?
Yeah, I actually was one of the few people. Well, I mean, I don't know about few because they definitely earned a bunch of voting points. They got 62. It's crowded down there at the bottom of the poll. And as someone who's done this for, I guess now 6 weeks, which feels a lot longer than that. But This is tough to do. And you've got to balance, not only the bunch of other either 1 loss or 2 loss or undefeated still, there are a handful of those guys still in there, teams that still exist in the rankings. And there was a ton of shakeup in this week's rankings is a bunch of, highly ranked teams played some other highly ranked teams. And there were a bunch of upsets as well. So this is just hard to do. I wouldn't say that they were treated unfairly necessarily. I think everyone saw that 33-point loss to Mississippi State, and that was a lot more visible than a 5-point win over a pretty bad Virginia Tech team, to be quite honest with you. I gave Pitt some grace. I kept them at 25. I dropped them down from, I think, 19th to 25th, just because they were playing a stretch of 3 straight they were playing a bunch of games on the road without a bunch of rest in between. They didn't get a ton of time to practice. They've been traveling long distances too, going down to Mississippi State and then back up to Virginia. So I cut them a little bit of slack with Damian Dunn also out for this stretch. I think they're, eventually, by the time ACC play gets underway, they're going to have Dunn back. They're going to be better rested. And I think they're going to look more like the team that we saw during the first part of this season. So I cut them some slack, but I don't think it's unfair at all if you saw a 33-point loss to a pretty good power conference opponent team and thought, maybe this team isn't in the top 20, isn't one of the 25 best teams in the country. Like, you also have to keep in mind that there are 360 something teams in Division I. There are a lot of teams that are vying for those spots in the top 25. And when you see a team like Pitt dropped out of there, I wouldn't take it too seriously. I wouldn't get too offended because it gets crowded there, especially at the bottom of the poll.
It is pre-conference play college basketball. Everybody and their mother is feeling like their team is really good. Their team's awesome. And just the reality is that when you get ranked, you can't get beat by 30. If they lose that game by 10, they probably still are ranked because it's like, okay, Mississippi State is just a good team and maybe that just happened there. But but if I'm looking at things for Pitt right now, if I'm a Pitt fan, don't be worried about the rankings right now. Be worried about how Pitt's playing. Be worried about their metrics. They did drop a little bit, a decent bit in the net rankings, but again, that can be climbed back up by their ACC play. They're going to get plenty of good opponents to play. And that's, I think that all those types of things will work themselves out, but they got to get back to playing consistent defense. I think that's the thing is they have great defense in spurts, but not consistently. And they need to get into their flow of offense a lot faster into games, because that's what's kind of letting them kind of get behind in some of these games. They were able to gut it out against Virginia Tech, just like they were able to gut it out against Ohio State, but you can't always be the team playing from behind. You need to be the team that's in control of the game. And the last, I'd say, 3-4 games, they haven't really been that. Virginia Tech, they had to come back on late. Mississippi State, they got walked out the door. Ohio State had to be a late comeback. Wisconsin, though they actually stormed out to an early lead there, but their lapses in the second half made them have to come from behind in the final minutes. I think that's the thing. It'd be interesting to see how Pitt adjusts. But like you said, losing Damian Dunn, not having an immediate answer. They've been trying Amsel Delalich, and then they've also been trying Zach Austin there in that 3 role. There's more questions there. And also the fact that Pitt played 5 straight games away from home. Their game this Wednesday, which we will both be at, will be their first game in basically 3.5 weeks at home. So that is a challenge and something to note.
Yeah. And so I think it's 3 games in 24 days coming up, going up until that's real earnest start of ACC play against Cal on New Year's Day. So Pitt, I think, is going to use the rest really well, get some practice time in, work on a bunch of stuff, but also get healthy and rest up. And I think that's going to be really critical for them.
Absolutely. He's Stephen Thompson. I'm Chris Carter. We are your Pittsburgh Post-Gazette Pitt beat writers here. Be sure to subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette by going to post-gazette.com to read all our written work. If you want to find us on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube, just search for the North Shore Drive podcast or the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's podcasting channel. We have our Tuesday mailbag where you can get your questions on air, just like Robbie, C. Michael, Griffin, and Roy. You can, and Calvin. Sorry, I almost forgot Calvin. You can get all your questions just like them on the air, and you can also check out our reactions after games right here on this podcasting channel from Chris and Steven. Have a great rest of your week. We'll keep you up to date with all things Pitt football and basketball as transfer portal season is just getting started. Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.